WOSU is part of a statewide collaborative of public media broadcasters for an initiative called American Graduate, Getting to Work. It's a national campaign supported by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Tonight's dialogue will be part of the larger conversation and outreach for this initiative that focuses on helping young people get the skill sets and training that they need to be part of the new workforce, especially for high-demand jobs in Ohio.
One of the things that I love about this book is that on the back there are these really impressive endorsements from important public figures. Marco Rubio, the senior senator from Florida, Yuval Levin, a friend of Orrin and mine, I think one of the most important leaders of the intellectual movement on the right. Mitt Romney, former presidential candidate, now a senator from Utah. By the top of the book, and on the front cover, is an endorsement from J.D. Vance, author of Hillbilly Elegy. I'd love to understand the thought process of how I beat out Mitt Romney to get spot territory here on the cover, but we'll leave that to private conversation.
It's ordered by how many copies each endorser has sold of their own book.
Got it, okay. So I think that a lot of different people should be interested in this book and in this topic. And I want to frame the conversation a little bit, but I don't want that framing to necessarily distract you or to make you less interested in what we're about to talk about. Because if you're interested in the future of work, if you're interested in what's happened to a lot of our communities, especially communities that are struggling in the wake of manufacturing loss in a host of ways, this is an important book. But I'm especially interested in it because I think that it is surfaced, and if you look at some of the commentary, some of the public editorials and opinion pages, a lot of the response to this book has surfaced really important issues for the part of the political spectrum that you and I both occupy, generally the right of center, the conservative part of the country. And the thing that I've noticed is against a very important backdrop in our country of, and within our movement, conversations about what will the Republican Party be, what will the conservative movement be for the new century. If we accept, and you and I would accept this probably, I'm sure many of you wouldn't, that Reagan was a good president. Reagan was a good president in the 1980s. He was solving 1980s problems. And what is it that our side is supposed to offer for people, not in the 1980s, but in 2018, 2020, and beyond? And that debate has often happened along a pretty standard dividing line. There are those who basically say that the Reaganite program of the 1980s is more or less good. It needs to be tweaked a little bit, but it will work for 2018 if we just have conviction and confidence in our principles and make that case to the American public. And then there are those of us, and I would put us on that side of the divide, who say whatever the answer is, we have to accept that this is a different country with a different set of problems, and our answers consequently have to be much different to those problems. And to me, your book is the first to get at, I think, one of the core underlying issues, disagreements, cleavages that has existed in our society. And the way that I'll put this is, a lot of people, when they think about what's happening in America, they look at the problem primarily through the lens, whether they know it or not, of consumption. And I don't just mean the bad kind of consumption, buying yachts or first-class vacations. Consuming food is consumption, consuming medicine, the basic necessities, that's all consumption. And there is, I think, a really powerful line of argument and a really dominant line of argument that has existed on both the left and the right that is effectively trying to measure the well-being of the country by how much we're consuming. And so the fact that GDP has increased pretty consistently, with obviously exceptions during recessions, for the past 40 or so years, and the fact that even among lower income Americans, if you adjust for their purchasing power, their consumption has increased if you factor in transfers and you factor in the fact that a lot of consumer goods have gotten a lot cheaper in the past 40 years. And so a lot of people will say, well, maybe we want a little bit more progress. It simply is not the case that things have gotten worse for the working class and for poor Americans. And this book comes along, I think, and says, no, that's not quite right. We're not applying the right framework to these challenges. And so I'd start by asking if you could just summarize your thesis in the context of that broader debate about whether it's consumption that drives the well-being of the country or whether it's something else.
Sure. Well, thank you on my behalf as well to everyone for coming, to the university for hosting me, and JD for hosting as well. It's really exciting to be here. This is what I've been calling my Midwest swing, having really interesting conversations with a lot of folks. I was in Chicago yesterday. We'll go to Michigan tomorrow. I know you're not supposed to say Michigan here. I'm sorry. But it's really interesting to focus on the lived experience and the perspective of folks who are experiencing, whether them personally or their communities, or they know people who are experiencing a lot of the challenges that are dominating so much of the political conversation right now. And that's really where I started in my work on the book, and what comes to this divide that JD is describing is, I think ideas really matter. Politics is about interests and fundraising and all of those things, but underneath it, there are actually ideas that motivate the beliefs that people hold, where they come down on various questions, the policies that we pursue. And there was an incredible disconnect between how everybody was measuring how things were going and how people actually clearly felt in a lot of cases about how things were going. And I was especially stunned in the aftermath of Trump's rise within the Republican Party and then his victory in the 2016 election. More than I was stunned by his success, I was stunned by the reaction, which was really both left and right of center. Well, we must have a marketing problem. It must be the case either that people don't understand how great they have it, that they don't understand that the policies we're describing are the right ones for them, or they're just kind of too racist to care. Like those are the three possibilities, and so we'd better come up with new ways to describe everything great that's happening. And when I looked at what was happening, what was clear was this evaluation we were doing in terms of consumption was just missing the point. That I think consumption is good, I think GDP growth is good and incredibly important, and we should celebrate rising living standards, but it's not actually what's most important to people. It's not what actually turns out to be important to them as individuals in a lot of cases. When you talk about lives well lived, when you talk about measures of personal satisfaction, when you look at mental health, production is actually much more important. Being a productive contributor to your community, whether that's through formal work in the labor market or other work in the family and the community, that's much more closely tied to your own well-being. It's much more closely tied to your economic opportunity. It's much more closely tied to whether families form in the first place, whether families stay together, whether children have good outcomes. And even when you look at the community level, what you find is actually the key predictors of opportunity for kids turn out to be things like, are there stable two-parent families in the community? Not just their own family, just in the community broadly. And are there people working in the community? Do parents grow up in households that have full-time workers and in communities where there are full-time workers? And by 2010, at the end of the recession, we were to the point within the white working class, which is what Charles Murray had been studying in particular, where only about half of white working class households even had a full-time worker. And as JD said, you can still get rising consumption. If you grow GDP, if you have enough redistribution, everybody's consumption can go up, and that has happened, and that's what everybody was looking at and scratching their heads at well, what's the problem? And I think the answer is that that's the wrong thing to look at, that we want those things, but those aren't where to focus. Where to focus is on our labor market, and whether we have a labor market where people, wherever they are, whatever their aptitudes and abilities are, can actually find work that's not just anywhere. I mean, obviously, unemployment rate's very low right now, but can they find work that's going to allow them to support their families and their communities? And by not thinking about that for so long, by just thinking about consumption, we had adopted a model of economic policy going back to the 1960s that just discounted work, that in effect abandoned workers, and that wherever there was a trade-off to be made, didn't consider the work side of that. And the result was the rising GDP, the rising consumption, and very, very serious problems in certain segments of our labor market. And so I think focusing through that lens and then talking about what it means for policy if we actually want to get that right just looking in that direction, a lot of the questions look very different. And then the good news is, to the extent that it's depressing that it's bad policy that created a lot of these problems, but the good news is that if it's not irresistible forces, if it's choices we made, then we can make better choices. And I think there's real opportunity to push our economic development in a direction that's going to be much better for work.
So let's push this from the abstract to the specific level. And one of the ways I'd say in which your view manifests itself as a criticism of what's been pretty orthodox policy across the left, right, and center is that you have some questions about our trade policy in the past 30 or 40 years. And so the pro-trade argument, broadly speaking, is, look, if you have free trade between the United States and China, or the United States and any other country, yes, you have job losses when workers and industries are exposed to foreign competition, but you also have cheaper consumer goods. And study after study shows that the net consumer welfare is ultimately better. You maybe lose $10,000 a year in salary, but you gain $11,000 a year in purchasing power through lower prices and so forth. What's wrong about that picture in your view? What does that argument fundamentally miss?
Yeah, so I think trade is a great example of a place where the rubber meets the road on these questions because, again, from a consumer welfare perspective, the case for unbridled free trade is pretty impeccable. I mean, it's hard to think of a situation where a consumer doesn't benefit from having more choices. Or you don't have to buy the stuff from somewhere else if you want, but why not have the choice? When you flip around and look at it from the perspective of the labor market, it just becomes a different question. And what turns out to matter the most is balance. From the consumer perspective, a trade deficit is actually a wonderful thing. A trade deficit represents other people sending us stuff for which we don't even have to send them something in return. That's fantastic. And in fact, you can find in the classical economics, in the standard economic arguments, explicit celebrations that, in a sense, the bigger the trade deficit, the better. From a labor market perspective, a large trade deficit is actually a really big problem. It represents essentially a large new supply of labor into our market, right? We have other workers all over the world now working to produce things for this market with no commensurate rise in demand, with no commensurate rise in people elsewhere in the world wanting to buy what the workers who are already here are making. And that imbalance isn't something we should want or that we should celebrate if what we really care about is the availability of jobs, the level of wages for workers here. And so I think it's important to say that's not an argument against free trade. If you said which would be better, $0 of trade between the US and China or $500 billion of trade between the US and China, the $500 billion is probably a lot better. You let both countries and their economies specialize in things where they're relatively more productive. You get better scale for your firms. You get a tremendous amount of benefits from the trade. The problem is what we have, which is $500 billion from China and less than $100 billion to China. And so it's those imbalances that we actually have to worry about and that you can't just command to go away, but you have to ask why they're arising and look at the conditions in the economy that are producing these imbalances and say, if we don't want the imbalances, what can we do about these conditions? Why did these conditions arise, and what policies would allow us to change them?
So what's fascinating about this in a lot of ways is that to me you're arguing we have to fundamentally rethink a presumption of, to use an overused term, elite policymaking for the past 30 or 40 years. Really the debate between left and right, or at least the folks on the left who have power and the folks on the right who have power, has effectively been how do we maximize growth? And then in which ways do we redistribute in an effort to accomplish our political goals? And so maybe folks on the left would say we should spend a little bit more on public education or on healthcare. Maybe folks on the right would say we'll spend a little bit more on the military. If we're going to do welfare, we should do it in a way that's tied to particular incentives. But that's really the terrain on which we've had these debates. And you're arguing, I just want to pause because I think it's such an important distinction. You're arguing, no, back up. There's a more fundamental disagreement here. We need to argue about labor market health. How do we make sure that workers both have jobs and live in communities and have the right sorts of community supports where they can be productive members of society? If you take a guy who loses his job but gets loses his job making $35,000 a year, replaces it with a part-time job making $12,000 a year, and then let's say government transfers that amount to $25,000 a year, well, theoretically, that guy's better off. He has more money in his pocket. But is he actually better off having gained a few $1,000s worth of consumption but lost out in the labor market? I think it's just such an important question. So I want to talk just about a couple of the pushbacks, just to give some sense of where our various public officials and media leaders have come out on this debate. So from the right, you've gotten some criticisms, and you've gotten some criticisms from the left as well. From the right, I think the criticism that I've seen come up most often is the idea that at a fundamental level, what you're talking about is a matter of community, civic, religious, individual life. And the job of the economy is to create prosperity, to create that money, that consumer ability. And the job of civil society is to worry about whether people are good workers or good fathers or good wives or good daughters, whatever the case may be. What's your response to that, this idea that you can sort of segment people into their life as workers and consumers on the one hand, and their life as everything else on the other?
Well, I don't want to start by saying they have a point, but they have a point, I think. It's absolutely true that when we talk about a lot of these sort of fundamental maladies that we have in working class, in impoverished communities, in a sense, a lot of problems do come down to individual decisions that people are making. And it's true that whatever the economic and social conditions you might be living in, better decisions can make a big difference. I mean, there's what folks call the success sequence, which is if you finish high school, get a full-time job, regardless of pay, and don't have kids until you're married, the chances of ending up in poverty are vanishingly small. And that's true. And it's important to say that and to emphasize that side of the equation. I think where the critics are wrong is to suggest that these are silos and that there's no interaction between the economic and social conditions we create and the kinds of decisions people make and the opportunities that are available to them. And so I think it's incredibly important for people across the political spectrum, but conservatives in particular struggle with this sometimes, to hold two ideas at the same time, that it's both incredibly important to emphasize personal responsibility and focus within civil society on what we can do, but that we should also want to be creating an economy that is inclusive, that makes it easier, not harder, to build a good life and make good decisions. And we actually have some control over that. And so it's fine to talk a lot about the civil society stuff, but it's a real abdication of responsibility as public figures, as policymakers, to refuse to talk about the other side of the equation as well, because that's where we can have an effect and we should want to have an effect.
Yeah, so the way that I put this, and this tension between how much of this is external, imposed by a community from outside, and how much of this is internal, this is a tension obviously that runs very much through my own book. And a tension I struggle with in my own life. I certainly see people making bad decisions. At the same time, I recognize that they're also facing some real obstacles and some real barriers. And to your point, it is sometimes hard to hold both of those thoughts in your head at the same time, but it's really important. And I thought Raihan Salam, in a podcast I listened to recently, put this, as executive editor of National Review, put this really interestingly, that there are both marginal and non-marginal people in any given context. There are the people who you drop them into an incredibly rough environment, they're going to achieve no matter what. They're going to make the right decisions, they're going to overcome extraordinary obstacles. But we also have to think about the context in which the median person is making decisions. It's one thing to say that the 99th percentile person is going to rise from poverty. It's another thing to say the 50th percentile person is we're just going to let that person go and not accept what I think is basic human intuition, that the environment that you're in, the people you're surrounded by, the labor market opportunities that you have, they form you, they shape you, they affect which decisions both seem rational or not rational. They also affect which decisions you ultimately make. And I think that's a really important point here, that you can still accept that people have responsibility for themselves without ignoring the fact that the context in which they live affects how that responsibility ultimately gets exercised. And that to me is a really important point. From the left, and I think I don't know, I guess I'll get the signal when we get one more question here from me, maybe some more after that. But the most compelling criticism, and it might not be right to call this from the left, but I think there is an interesting question here about what has driven worker wages to the point of stagnancy. What has made it so hard for the average blue-collar American to get a high-quality job? And so, we could talk about the decline of unions, we could talk about trade policy, we could talk about a lot of other things. But the argument you often hear from folks on the left is to think about workers and whether they're able to produce effectively ignores that people aren't being paid according to what they're producing. That's sort of a neoclassical mathematical model that doesn't work, makes sense in the real world. That whether a worker has a job, whether a worker earns a certain wage is fundamentally about the bargaining relationship between the employer and the employee. And so at a fundamental level, we should be strengthening unions and doing things like that if we want to fix the labor market, especially for blue-collar workers. You don't necessarily disagree with that, actually, but I know your view is pretty nuanced there, so I just want you to respond to that particular point.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating issue, and one of the things I wish I could have done a whole section of the book on, but it would have been incredibly boring. But it's fine to sort of say labor market, and but like, what is the labor market? I mean, in some respects, it is a market, and it behaves like a market, but it's not a market like the supermarket. It's not a market like the stock market. The nature of the transactions going on are between, we say employers provide jobs, but technically the employer is the buyer here. The employer is trying to purchase the work, and it's the worker who's supplying work in a sense. And that transaction, when it works out, we call it a job. But people aren't products, which I partly mean in a moral sense, but it's also true in an economic sense. People don't behave the way widgets behave in a market. And so it's really important to recognize when we're talking about how to make the labor market work better, that it's not simply a matter of, well, if everyone, if we could make everyone 15% more productive, everyone's wages would go up 15%. Or if only there were sort of more demand here or less supply here, these would automatically translate in kind of an Econ 101 sense. And so I think it's on the one hand incredibly fair and important to take that holistic view and say, no, we're talking about an incredibly complex social phenomenon here. And so the kinds of policies we should be talking about, I think organized labor is a really important one. The answer isn't just, well, if we didn't have any organized labor, that would be great because it would be a freer market. Organized labor can provide an incredibly important function in producing better outcomes for workers. And so I think one thing we have to talk about is how to make organized labor work better. At the same time, and this is almost sort of a parallel argument to the one I just made with respect to the right, we can hold two ideas in our head at the same time here, which is that the labor market isn't a perfect market. It doesn't always behave exactly like a market, but it is subject to market forces. And at the margin, the things that we do vis-a-vis the behavior in the market are going to have market-like effects. So to the extent that we do constrain, say, the supply of less skilled workers in the economy, other things equal, that is going to have a positive effect on the wages that less skilled workers in the market can command. To the extent that we do encourage, or at least make it easier for firms to make investments in the kinds of businesses that are going to employ blue-collar workers in manufacturing, in construction, in infrastructure, in resource extraction, we should expect to get more investment there and to create more jobs there. We were talking about the trade context. International trade is incredibly messy. There's a whole separate field called open macroeconomics when you move into the world of these different economies with different rules and different currencies. So you can't just assume a simple model there either, but other things equal, if having a large trade imbalance is going to be a problem for the workers here who used to make the things that we are now importing with no commensurate increase in exports. So I think it's fine to acknowledge all the complexity, but none of that absolves us of responsibility to look at where we do have levers we can pull, sure, and focus on finding ways to pull them.
Sure. So I want to ask people to start lining up at the mic to ask questions, and I'll ask one more question while people are lining up. But I'll tell a brief story first. I was at a conference in Aspen, of all places, a couple of years ago. And after some of the main programming, I was at a small dinner. And I don't remember most of the people who were there, but I do remember that one of the guys I was sitting with was a pretty senior person at the AFL-CIO. And somebody told a story about one of the senior investment banker executives in the country who had given a speech off the record. And the tenor of the speech was more or less this. Somebody asked him a question, aren't you worried about what's happening to American manufacturers, American workers, and so forth? And his response was effectively, I have international clients, I have international customers, I have people that I do business with overseas. Why do I care about what's going on to the American worker more than I care about what's going on with the Chinese worker or the Indian worker or the German worker? And what was interesting is that in this table, and I think I was the only person who identified as a Republican, it was me and the AFL-CIO guy who were just aghast. We were so angry. How dare you think that you don't have any obligation to the workers of your own country? This country helped develop you, it helped train you, it built the infrastructure upon which you've been able to build this business. And I wonder if there's a bit of that, call it economic patriotism or even economic nationalism, if there's a bit of that in the once and future worker. Because if I'm the CEO of Apple, if I'm Tim Cook, I probably make more money, at least in the short term, by not following your advice, but I probably am better to my workers, at least my American workers, by following your advice. Do you think that's a right or correct way to think about it?
Well, there's definitely an economic nationalist component to the argument. And I think part of it is just purely sort of just a statement of reality, which is that we are a political country and a democracy, and our policymakers are responsible for choosing policies that help the people in the country, and they are accountable to the voters of the country. So it almost before you get to the kind of philosophical question of who you should care about, there's just a reality that our obligation is actually to pursue policy that is going to be good for the people who are in this country. And if you don't, you're going to get voted out. And one thing I say is, in a democracy, a miserable majority is everybody's problem. So it doesn't matter how great your philosophical claim to care as much about the Chinese worker is. Like, that's not a valid position to take as a policymaker in the United States.
Yep.
So that's one of the arguments that I always start with is the philosophy almost doesn't interest me, because at the end of the day, if we want to have the United States as a responsible actor in the international arena, if even ultimately you do care about all the people of the world, we'd still better get our house in order. And so we should focus there for that reason. If you push me to have to the philosophical debate, I still think it holds true. I think it's actually really important for us to maintain the idea of America as a nation whose people share common bonds of obligation. A huge number of the institutions we rely upon, whether it's our system of taxation and redistribution, our social insurance like Social Security and Medicare, our military, all of our education system, all of these things are tied up in those mutual bonds. And if you start picking and choosing which ones you find convenient to endorse or ignore, everyone else is going to do that too for their own sake, and it sort of falls apart. So I certainly think it's important to have the discussion about what's happening elsewhere in the world and what we can do that benefits people internationally as well, both because it's in our interests and as a moral matter. But I do think our first objective has to be to figure out how to help American citizens and how to get our nation to a place economically and more importantly as a society that we're proud of, that's strong and healthy and that's sustainable. Not in the environmental sense, but in the true sense of what sustainability means, which is, ultimately that leaving the next generation in a position at least as good as the last one was in. And I would say that over the past generation, we have not done that.
Well, thank you. I know we have a few folks who have questions, so sir, just go ahead and fire away.
Sure. What I'm hearing is talking about labor and jobs as they have been. But the other part of your book supposedly was labor in the future. A American appliance manufacturer just is opening a new plant in Tennessee and closing a plant in Mexico. And when asked why, because labor is so much more expensive in the United States, he says, well, there's only 2 man-hours in a refrigerator. And we have politicians saying they're going to do away with the coal mining business, politicians saying they're going to bring it back, but fracking for natural gas is killing the coal mining business. So how do we get the labor that is tied emotionally, positionally, geographically to dying labor? How do we position that into the labor that we're going to need in the future?
No, thank you. That's a great question. As you said, we're talking about the once and future worker. And I think the important place to start as we talk about sort of the effect of technology and innovation and disruption and so forth is to recognize that that's something that's always been with us. That we have had periods in American history where all of those things were happening. Silver mining was booming or busting. We stopped using whale oil because I don't even know when we stopped using whale oil or why, but we did. And that wasn't good for the whalers. Those things aren't inherently bad for the labor market or for workers, generally speaking. The nature of work, the type of work that people are doing is always going to change. But if you have those disruptions, if you have that dynamism happening in the context of a healthy labor market, by which I mean one that has balance in looking at trade, that has immigration flows that are attentive to where there is more and less demand, that has a regulatory structure that encourages new business investment where you might lose old business investment, where you have an education system that's actually geared toward preparing people for the jobs that might be available. In that context, disruption, generally speaking, is a good thing. It's actually very closely linked to rising productivity. And for the individual who's disrupted, there's no question it can be very painful. But what we've gotten so wrong recently is that we've created that disruption into an unhealthy labor market. We've thrown people out of work. We've introduced these trade flows. We've seen certain industries dying, and there's nothing on the other side. So that's the one thing I would say is that the commitment has to be to making sure there's something on the other side. And then specifically, I think the appliance example is actually a really important one to emphasize because it's really important to recognize, I think, 2 things about all of the automation that's occurring that people are concerned about. One is that it's happening incredibly slowly. There will always be the specific example of the particular plant that is in a moment of automation. But economy-wide, we actually measure very carefully the rate at which productivity is growing, the rate at which we're producing more with fewer people. And productivity growth is at an all-time low and has been for some time. So we're actually automating things slower than ever. And on the one hand, that's incredibly counterintuitive, but robotics, artificial intelligence, these are amazing technologies. They're not more amazing than electricity or, or industrialization or computerization. We've had these things happen before, and we've never had productivity growth get above about 2.5%. We're down closer to 1%, some years at 0% right now. And the reason for that is that these things are incredibly slow to actually make their way into the economy, to actually make their way into businesses. I mean, we had computers, at what you would call a computer at MIT in the 40s or 50s. We are still trying to figure out how to deploy it in your HR department. The number of layers of abstraction and that needed to be placed on it, the same goes for the new technologies. Is one part, and then the second part is, in almost all cases, technologies take on a part of what a worker does, but not everything that a worker does. When you do good studies of the disruption that's coming, there are very few jobs that are just going to disappear. There are a lot that the technology can do a significant chunk of, which means you'll need fewer workers for a given role, but you still need workers, which is great news for the workers. And it means that you can only deploy the technology as fast as you can get it to work with the workers you have. There's no huge pool of highly skilled workers sitting on the sidelines waiting to leap in and replace the workers that we have. So for all those reasons, it's going to go slowly. It's ultimately going to accrue to the benefit of workers. And it's going to be a challenge, partly for policymakers, a lot for the business community to figure out how to do it. And what we're seeing right now is they're actually really struggling with that. And I think we'd be better off if they were figuring it out, if we could actually move a little bit faster in some respects. Sir?
So I'd like to ask this question of both of you. I'd like to ask the question more of a foundational perspective, and it goes back to community, which you started off with in this discussion. And in this country, we have the rich tradition of individuals being respected by our founding fathers. And so for many of us, it's the physical and the intellectual and the spiritual triangle that every day has to be nurtured. And if we look at institutions that are failing us, starting with the intellectual, the public schools, we haven't moved the needle on any of the major cities' education over the last 50 years. And so we're generating an uneducated workforce, potentially with those individuals, unless they are the extraordinary individual that J.D. mentioned. If we go to the physical, the companion book to Hillbillyology, obviously, from an Ohio perspective, is a dreamland. And the opioid crisis, which is really creating a problem, because if you're an employer well into almost the 50% range, they fail the test and can't be employed. Yep. And if we think about the spiritual, there is kind of a lack of dedication into what this higher power is. What is it about being a citizen and a participant is all about. The psychic income that comes from doing a good day's labor in the old days, I think still holds true for many, but not all. So could you address the foundational issue? I haven't read your book, so I apologize. Didn't think I had to before I came. So, but I will as I leave. But I think the bigger question is, are we really missing the boat in curing those foundational issues to help us prepare for the workforce of the future?
So I'll answer briefly and remind everybody that if you haven't read Warren's book, it's called The Once and Future Worker. Copies are being sold outside. It can be found in bookstores online and brick and mortar places everywhere. I'll answer this question very quickly because I want to hear Warren's response, and I know we have other folks who have questions. But to me, I guess I think of the foundational issue as health of communities. That really, to me, is the takeaway of both my life and a lot of the research that I did related to the book and stuff that I've written completely outside of the book. It's that it's one thing for a kid to grow up in a traumatic or chaotic home. It's another thing for a kid to grow up in a block where 8 of the 9 families are chaotic and traumatic. It's one thing for your parent to lose a job. It's another thing for over half of the parents on your block to not have jobs. That once you reach a point of real saturation of some of these social problems, they start to become self-perpetuating. They perpetuate across the generations, and they reduce the pool of people who are able to make some extraordinary lift and get out of the worst of what they were, of what they grew up in. And to me, there is, and I've been persuaded by Warren's book on this point, that while work isn't everything, a big part of what's happened is that in some of the communities, southeastern Ohio, where Sam focused Dreamland on, there was this sudden and immediate loss of entire social fabric because all of the work went away. And then all of these problems that I saw growing up and that I wrote about, they become endemic, they become self-replicating. And there's just no one in a community anymore who's able to both give people a sense of hope, who's able to provide some social support when one family goes down on their luck. And I think that to me is the foundation, is that community social fabric that's disintegrated for a lot of reasons. But I think part of it does go to the question of work and how quickly we've lost a lot of jobs without anything to replace them.
I certainly agree with that. I would say that, and as JD put it, work isn't everything, but work is a prerequisite for getting this stuff right. And I think the mistake we made in so much of our public policy was, again, to think, well, if the work might go away, but as long as somebody's winning, we can redistribute, and everybody therefore can win. And the reality is that a community where the jobs have gone away and redistribution has shot up, people there are not winning. It's not a sustainable model. And the key thing that I try to emphasize, and this goes a little bit to the manufacturing point in particular, part of all the claim that consumption is all that matters is an idea that people sort of cling nostalgically to manufacturing, but that's irrational. And that's something that left of center and right of center economists will feel very smart saying. And it's not true. First of all, manufacturing is one of the places where less educated men can work most productively. Those are just better jobs than the kinds of service jobs that you might see them moving into instead. But secondly, it's incredibly important that every community actually makes something that the rest of the world wants. Every community wants an awful lot of stuff from the rest of the world. Energy, medicine, computers, cars, and every community has to have something to send in return. So it's fine if 80% of the local economy is service jobs, but you can't all serve each other coffee. And one of the things that happens if the kinds of jobs that actually produce tradable goods vanish from a community is you end up doing what I call exporting need. Becoming eligible for transfer programs is literally how the wealth comes into your community. So think the dilapidated shopping plaza with a sparkling occupational therapy office in it. That occupational therapy office is literally the community's exporter. It is exporting to the nation's taxpayers care of the people in the town who are now on disability. And you'll see the Obama administration, the Department of Agriculture, promoted signing up for food stamps on the ground that it's good for your local economy. And it's not an acceptable model. And so focusing on work is partly about the ways we've talked about it being core to family formation, to the health of communities in that respect. It's also just core to the ability of the community to exist at all. And so part of what I want to argue is that making sure that work is still available and that labor markets are healthy is one of those foundational issues. And it's not the only one. We're not going to solve the spiritual question that way. But it's one of the things that policymakers at least have influence over, and so we'd better get it right.
Sir.
Good evening. We're having this conversation at Ohio State tonight. Both of you have spent time at a variety of really great universities. Do you have any specific recommendations or ideas on the role that this nation's great universities should be playing in all of this, and what sort of proactive things we could be doing to influence what's going on? Thanks.
Yeah, I'll answer, and then I'm going to make you say whether you agree or not. Unfortunately, I don't think universities have much of a role to play here beyond giving back all the money. Not to those students in the crowd who are applauding because they think you get the money back. That's not what I meant. We have a bizarre situation in this country where we have built an education system that is oriented around the idea of college for all. Our high schools are, by and large, college prep academies. And then all of our funding, maybe $150 billion a year, goes to subsidizing higher education for the people who are in college. But the people who are in college, if college is actually going to work for them and they're going to complete an economically useful degree, they're already the economic winners in this picture. They're not the people we're talking about. They're not the segment of the labor market we're talking about. There is still a majority of the country that doesn't earn even a community college degree. And as the prior question alluded to, that's something we've made essentially no progress on. I mean, we have doubled per pupil spending and not moved test scores at all in 40 years. We've barely increased the share that earns a BA by the age of 25 in 2 generations. And I'm all for continuing to invest in that. We should be doing everything we can to do better, but we shouldn't believe that that's somehow the answer on any reasonable time frame. And so then the question is, well, why do we spend $150 billion a year on the people in the college pathway, and if you're not going to college, you get 0, right? If you're somebody who the college track in high school doesn't make a lot of sense, maybe there's a vocational school 3 towns over. That's backward. It's, I would argue, the most regressive institution we have in this country right now. And if we want to actually solve this problem from the education perspective, we need to be investing in a pathway for people who are not going to succeed in college. Hey, applause. That is, that it is up to the family and the student which pathway they want to be on. But that makes it all the more our obligation to build a pathway that's attractive, that says by the age of 20, we could get you technical training, several years of subsidized experience in a job, earnings, an industry credential, a job, and probably some earnings in the bank already. By the way, that's the way the rest of the developed world does it. They think we're crazy. And it's going to take, it's not something we can do overnight. But the good news is it isn't that much of a policy problem. We actually know what it looks like to do that better. What we don't know is how to win the political fight to actually start that change. And even more importantly, we don't know how to have the cultural discussion to make people comfortable recognizing that preparing for and moving into a good blue-collar vocation and becoming a constructive member of a community and a contributor and building a strong family, that is success. And so it's actually more, I think, ultimately a cultural challenge than a policy one. But it would certainly be wonderful to have universities selflessly jump into that discussion as well.
I'll answer briefly and not in quite the same inflammatory way. But I think that, to Oren's point, there does need to be a bit of a culture shift, especially among elite institutions of higher education, in recognizing what's actually driving progress for the median worker and the 80th percentile worker, the well below median worker. There are, I imagine, a lot of students in here. I imagine most of them are students at Ohio State University. Ohio State is the state's flagship institution. I'm an alumni, so I'm biased, but I think it's the best university in the state. But the students here are almost by definition not the median worker. They're not even the 70th percentile worker. The graduates of this school will have better labor market outcomes than at least 80% of their peers in the state, probably even higher than that. And I think there's this really powerful and in some ways admirable egalitarian attitude, and I get asked questions about this when I go and give talks and talk about the book, this idea that, well, college was really an important avenue for you to escape poverty. And what we've just got to do is get more and more people into the university track. And what I think it will accept, what needs to happen, what people need to accept is that just because it's the pathway for some kids doesn't mean it's going to be the pathway for other kids. And if we only invest in that one pathway, then a lot of kids who have no chance of succeeding in an institution like Ohio State, who don't want to succeed in an institution like Ohio State, are never going to have the same opportunities. And that's not what I want. I think it's great when a kid from a circumstance like mine gets to a great university like this, gets a great education, learns a lot, and goes on to success and happiness. But a lot of kids that I grew up with, their dream wasn't to go to Ohio State and then to law school. Their dream was to get a decent job and have a family. And that ambition is okay. In fact, I think it's an admirable ambition, and we ought to make it more possible for more kids. Yeah.
That was my first question.
Okay.
Now I have a good answer to that. My second question is, and you've sort of talked about this and addressing some of these other questions, should we have some fundamental policy change in helping people that are put out of work because of a change in our technology or, competition from other countries? Should we have some kind of policy to help these people? Because I think a lot of times they're just put out of their jobs, and like you say, they're just lost. They don't know where to turn. It seems like there should be something in place, somewhere to go, somehow to make them more flexible or give them some hope to find a new job.
So I think yes, and for follow-up detail, I'll kick it over to Warren.
I think yes as well. I think the important thing to emphasize is that at the core of that should be a different job. That the solution can't be, okay, now we just wrap around you this series of social insurance programs that takes care of you because you lost your job. So from that starting point, that the solution ultimately should be another job, and therefore then there's a whole bunch of policy we have to talk about. How do we have a labor market that has other jobs? And by now we've actually hit on a whole bunch of it, from regulation to education to trade and immigration. There are so many things we can do. But then a piece of it also has to be, okay, but what's the actual tip of the spear on helping the person in that position? And there are kind of three things I would mention that I think are especially useful and worth keeping in mind. Although now I've made the Rick Perry thing of saying mistake of saying three, and we'll see if I remember all three. One is, how do you do retraining? Government is incredibly bad at retraining, and we just know that. The results for government retraining programs are incredibly depressing. Conversely, employer-led retraining we know works. And so making sure that our retraining programs are about, again, getting people back connected to the workforce quickly. If we have to subsidize it, if we have to say, the first year you take this person on, we're going to pay their wage, or a part of their wage, or fund their training, fine, but let's make sure the employer is the one who's figuring out what job there's actually demand for and how they can learn how to do it. Second, and relatedly, one of the key things that is problematic with our kind of college for all model is that we now also don't have anything for people later in life. If you say someone needs retraining, you turn around and say, well, where are our great institutions of preparing people for the labor force? They're four-year colleges, right? And obviously there's more than that, and there's evening programs, there's community colleges, but generally we're oriented around an education system for 18 to 22-year-olds doing something full-time. And that's not going to work for a 45-year-old with 3 kids and a mortgage. So one of the huge benefits of investing in an alternative pathway for younger people is it actually starts to look a lot like something you could offer to people later in life too. And so we want to have that available. And then the third component is that I think this is a reason to focus more on organized labor. That the unions as they exist today do not do this well. but a system of organized labor that were organizations, worker-led, both within an industry to support people when they've lost one job, or in a different industry to absorb people into a growing industry and provide some of this connection to an employer, how to do good training. Again, other countries do this much better than we do, and that's a role that we are missing from civil society that current unions effectively crowd out, but that better worker-led organizations should help with. And so those are the places that I kind of focus as we figure out how to get that piece of it right.
I was wanting to, first off, start this with saying that I worked 35-some years, not in the coal mine industry, but compensating coal miners. And so I had a bit of history with that whole industry, even though it was all in Columbus, Ohio. And what I found back in '78 is a good population that we worked with. Don't know what the population was exactly, but a lot of them were totally illiterate. And when I retired, that was not the case at all. And so education has happened. And there's the difference in the workday. There were people I've talked to in the past that the way you got coal out of the coal mine is you loaded up a cart and the pony carried it out. And that would be laughable anymore. And one of the great differences is nothing to do with the price of gas competes the price of coal, is that we still produce a hell of a lot of coal in the United States. Probably about, I'm guessing, 70% from our peak. And what I kind of think about this whole rhetoric about we're going to bring coal mines back is that if I could develop the market for coal mines to get it back to the 100% level because of automation, which has made tremendous difference in coal mining, with strip mining that's huge and things called longwall mines that one guy operates a machine that would at one time have literally dozens or hundreds of people getting that amount of coal out. So if we could reverse the demand to what it was, say, 10 years ago, we probably really wouldn't have much of a change in the population of coal miners. So what do we do with that kind of rhetoric that we're going to increase, we're going to get coal mining back, but it's never going to happen because you just don't really need the workers anymore.
No, I think it's exactly right. Coal mining jobs aren't coming back. I mean, at the margin, it could be up a little or down a little, but it's not going to be what it used to be. But I think, and coal mining, across any number of industries, you've seen this kind of incredible gain over time. Something like that automation that you're describing has come in, I believe, over the last 35 years, right? It's not like there was a single point where they flipped the switch. And so ultimately in that industry, as in others, I don't know what exactly productivity gains within coal mining are, but my guess is they've actually been of the same magnitude. In other words, it's been that small gain every year. And whether that's a problem is a question of what else is going on in the economy. It might be that we don't need a whole lot more coal, but if you had other industry in the area that was growing, typically you would have expected, therefore, more of the employment to grow in those places, which is important for anybody who's dislocated. But it's also important to keep in mind that with automation in particular, because it happens slowly, it typically actually happens more slowly than attrition is happening within the industry anyway. In other words, the effect isn't that you have to throw a whole lot of people out of work, it's that you stop hiring people in. And so that's almost the way to think about it, to say, as coal mining became less labor intensive, what else was there to hire people into? And the fact that the answer was nothing is a better way of understanding the problems that arose. And so just one more thing to come back to this point about what has happened with productivity growth is we hear well, we're getting productivity growth, we're seeing more automation, and that's therefore we're losing jobs. And as a descriptive matter, that's technically true, but again, it's always been true. We've always gotten productivity growth, which means we've always been destroying jobs. No one talks about all of those jobs destroyed by automation in the 50s or the 60s, even though productivity growth was at least as high, because output was also growing. If you ask what's happened, imagine 10 workers who each make a widget every day, so 10 workers making 10 widgets. Their productivity goes up, now they can make 20 widgets. Historically, what happened was you started making 20 widgets. You still had the 10 workers, now they were making 20 widgets. They're much more productive, output is higher, they can also earn more money. The switch that's flipped isn't that suddenly we're making more widgets faster. It's that we stopped going from 10 to 20 widgets. Instead, we said, oh, well, if 10 workers could make 20, well, 5 can make the 10 that we were making. So now let's just use 5 workers for the 10 widgets. And so when you ask what's actually changed, it's not the automation and the productivity. It's that output growth stopped going up. If output growth in manufacturing had continued since 2000 at the same rate as 1950 to 2000, we would have more manufacturing workers today than we did in 2000. Instead, we've lost a third of them. The trend line that changed wasn't the automation. The trend line that changed was output stopped. And so that's, I think, where we have to focus. And again, the good news is there's nothing about technological trends, there's nothing about economic growth that says output's supposed to stop going up. That's something that can in theory, be a very bright future, I think.
So I know it's getting late, so we'll do quick questions and then quick answers.
I don't do quick answers, but I'll try.
I'll cut you off.
All right.
Do you think that increasing the availability of micro-enterprise lending to the population that you were alluding to earlier, the underemployed population, could have a significant impact on their access to capital and also, of course, help them to become employed for themselves?
Not especially. That's the really short answer. I'll say a little bit more. I think there are probably places where that's the case, and this is also not something in which I have a lot of expertise, but I wouldn't say in general that sort of a lack of liquidity or access to credit in the financial markets is one of our main challenges. And I also certainly wouldn't say it's something that I think has gotten worse. So I'm certainly open to the possibility that that's a good kind of mechanism to help certain groups, but at least for me, it's not at the kind of top of my list of sort of major areas that we have an issue.
Thank you.
Mr. Cass, in your book, you had mentioned in the U.S. over the last 30, 40 years, we have a lot more limited labor market churn. People don't move from job to job as often as they used to, and they especially don't move from place to place for jobs at nearly the level that they used to. And you mentioned specifically, quoting you here, that takes deep reserves of social capital. Maybe if you could talk about that briefly and what we can do to get some of that back.
Yeah, sure. And then I'm throwing the geographic mobility question to you. One of the big arguments that comes from folks who, especially from the right, who disagree with what I'm saying, is they'd say, well, people should just move to places where there's more opportunity. If you're in a coal mining town, and there are no more jobs, move to New York or San Francisco.
People actually say this, though.
Not
He's
only
not just being snarky. People do say that.
I'm glad you have to clarify which of my comments are snarky. Not only do they say this, they actually do studies showing how much higher GDP would be if only everybody moved to the most productive cities. And with that, they observe that, in fact, geographic mobility has declined. And so maybe that's an explanation for some of our problems. And what I say about that is I think that gets it backward. That geographic mobility is great, and anybody who wants to move in search of opportunity, that's terrific and part of the American dream and promise and model. It is equally the American dream and promise and model that you don't have to move. And that historically, we celebrate, moving west, young man, and all of that. During the depth of the Great Depression in the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma, that decade, the population of Oklahoma dropped 2%. And in fact, it dropped not because out-migration increased, it dropped because in-migration decreased. So fair enough, not quite as many people moved to Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl. But it's not as if everyone left. Through the entire mechanization of agriculture, the population of Iowa never declined. Now, people moved. I mean, that's not to say no one moved, but it has never been the norm that, sorry, these ways of life are just not viable and you all have to leave. And technology hasn't caused that to be the case. And I think it's really important to emphasize that people are actually, I think, less likely to move when you have these problems that we're talking about. It's not the case that we have these problems because people aren't moving. It's the case that when you don't have strong communities, when you don't have strong families, when you don't have an education system that's preparing people appropriately, to then turn around and say, like, well, just go be a welder in Houston, is really easy to say if you're someone with huge stores of social capital and education, like, yeah, that makes sense, and I probably moved 3 times and whatever else. But the median American still lives 18 miles from their mom, adult. So most adult Americans live within 18 miles of their mother. And some of the mothers in the room are saying, yeah. And I think we have to embrace and celebrate that and say that that has to be something that still works. And if our system's not working, then we have to fix it, not say, well, then go move. But I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, the way that I think about the geographic mobility question is it's often framed as either we're going to save every town, or everybody needs to move to New York, San Francisco, or maybe if you're really slumming it, Chicago. That's sort of what people say, and I think that the better way to think about this is that people do move. That is sometimes a good thing. It's not always a good thing. It's better when it's driven by what they want and their own ambitions, as opposed to a sense of desperation that if they stay where they were born or within 18 miles of their mom, they're going to starve to death. And so I like to think about this, that we need to be creating regional centers of economic power. Columbus obviously is that for the Midwest, certainly the state of Ohio. I think Lexington is that, Charleston is that, and sort of some of the parts that are deeper into central Appalachia. We have some real problems, though, when the only answer is move to one of these 2 coastal sectors of economic power, especially when housing costs in San Francisco eat up virtually all of the benefit that you get from moving to San Francisco, especially if you're a low-income American. And so the way that I think we should be thinking about this from an economic development policy on a national scale is we may not be able to keep the population of every small and medium-sized town at the exact same level, and we may not want that. But if we create some situation where people can move 20 miles away, 50 miles away, and have some viable work opportunities, that's a pretty good thing. This point about telling people to move to the coast, my grandparents were in incredibly impoverished circumstances in southeastern Kentucky when they moved to southern Ohio. But they could still go back and see their family on the weekends. They had kin in the broader southwestern Ohio area, to your point about social capital. If somebody had told my grandfather in 1949, you need to move to San Francisco and learn to be a computer programmer, that is just not a viable model for most. That's not how we're going to do economic development and promotion of opportunity in this country. It's much better to create some real centers of economic power in a place like Cincinnati or Columbus, where, yeah, not everybody can work in their hometown, but there's at least some economic vibrancy and ability to work in a place where you maintain your connections to the people who made you who you are.
Thank you both for coming.
Make it good.
Yeah, no pressure.
Yeah. So I guess my question is a bit broader, more about spectrums in general. We've heard you both say tonight things about right versus left versus center. I wonder, it's no stranger, no one is a stranger to the fact that we live in highly hyper-partisan times, and I wonder if we do ourselves a disservice by thinking about particular economic systems or any systems of sociological issues in terms of, are we not pigeonholing ourselves to say what you guys are proposing is, by your own admission, center right? What does that really mean? Why can't what you all are proposing simply be, this is the reason we're proposing what we're proposing is simply we've followed the evidence, we've followed the data, and that has led us to believe that what we're proposing now here tonight is simply the right way to do things. Not the right way, but the correct way, not the right way, the correct way. So what I mean is, aren't we hurting ourselves more, especially in a discussion like this that is an intellectual discussion? If even an intellectual discussion like this is marked by that kind of labeling,
So
are we helping ourselves?
So let me answer the question, because I got us started on this path. And when I started, I tried to make it as clear as I could that I think Oren's book is full of good ideas. But I also think for those of us who pay attention to these intra-party disputes, they're also incredibly significant, and the debate that it's started on the right has been especially significant. Not to pigeonhole Oren's book as saying it's only a conservative book, I think it's also a very good book. And there are ideas, I think, that are very much not within the mainstream, or at least not broadly accepted by quote-unquote conservative economists, which I think is why it's inspired such a great discussion. But so I broadly agree with your point that it's important not to pigeonhole ourselves and important not to sort of take a hyper-partisan lens on this or apply a hyper-partisan lens, because then you miss a lot of really good discussion, you miss a lot of really good ideas. Here's why I think it is important to talk about these problems and to be cognizant of where they fit on the partisan or ideological spectrum, at least with this book in particular. I have been involved in right-of-center political circles for not that long, but long enough to know that there are, in my view, some really bad ideas that refuse to die. One of those ideas is that the only way that you can do good conservative economic policy is by cutting taxes. I think that is a terrible idea. I think it's led to a lot of terrible policy. But it's important to be knowledgeable about where your ideas fit on the spectrum, because at the end of the day, if you want to do anything in this country, you have to get 51% of the people to vote for it and to agree with it. And so it's useful to be mindful of the coalition politics that exist so that you can hopefully build enough of a solid majority so that these very good ideas in Oren's book can actually become public policy. And the last point that I'd make on that front is I think we're in such a fascinating time in American politics. My friend Michael Lind once told me, he's a political scientist at the University of Texas, he once told me that if you think of American politics as represented by four people, four leaders of four ideological movements in the country, Hillary Clinton is one, Donald Trump is another, Paul Ryan is a third, and Bernie Sanders is a fourth. His view is that in 20 years, Paul Ryan and Hillary Clinton will be part of the same political party on the one side, and Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders will be part of the same political party on the other side. Now, is it useful to pigeonhole yourself all the time? No, and hopefully I don't think my hope is that this has not been perceived as pigeonholed or as interesting or useful only to a right-of-center audience. But I do think it's interesting to think about where those coalition segments are going to go in the ensuing 10, 20, 30 years, because my goal here, while I love talking about this stuff, and Oren's a great guy, he's a good friend, he's a very smart person, I love having this conversation. What I want more than anything is for people to be able to find dignified work and meaning. And for that to happen, these ideas have to become public policy, and you've got to think about the nuts and bolts of politics to make that happen.
We should just finish on that. But I'll be like, while the credits are rolling, I'll say one other thing. So So I agree entirely with what you said, and I think someone will go back and read the transcript and tell me I'm wrong. I don't think we've said any of the ideas in here are necessarily center-right. And many people who claim to be the center-right would say they're absolutely not. In the last 2 weeks, I've been called a Marxist, a fascist,
Jim Crow.
My vision is to return to the Jim Crow South, a kind of big government conservative. So what I find so interesting about it, the topic and thinking about the politics, is that when you know, to my point that I started with, that I think ideas really matter. When you go back to the ideas and just start from there, you end up in some actually very interesting places. And I think we're actually seeing a very strange shuffling of our politics, a realignment that we haven't had in a long time and is perhaps overdue. And it's very clear, you know, I spend as much time talking to Democratic senators and their staffs as Republican senators and staffs at this point. But I could also tell you which Democratic senators and Republican senators don't want to talk about it. And so it's interesting to kind of say, well, like, what are the first principles that are therefore starting to emerge and form these divides? And as JD was saying, I think exactly spot on in the intro, we fought for a very long time just about size of government. Big government or small government, essentially. Or in terms of, as we've been talking about consumption, what's the best way to grow consumption and how much should we redistribute? Those were the fights. And we are heading into an era now, it seems, where the fight is going to be much more centered, in a sense, on this question of work. It's going to be about, in a sense, is our non-negotiable first principle that we push ahead with certain principles of economic progress that we're really passionate about, or to the extent that those are actually creating real social problems, do we say, no, we have to sort of stop, and we like trade and immigration and all of, like, in principle, those things are great. College, I like college. But you earn the right to pursue that vision by showing that it can actually work for everybody. Or are those things your first commitment, and you kind of figure out on the back end how to help people who it might leave behind? I think that's the debate that we're headed toward. It's very interesting both within the right and we will see within the left. You can make statements along those lines, and people who are used to agreeing on absolutely everything will suddenly realize that they completely disagree and can't even believe what the other person is saying. And so that's really exciting, but it's going to create a lot of strange shuffling. And as JD said, I hope the outcome is that we find a pretty robust coalition behind the idea that starting from work and a healthy society has to be the first principle, and we build from there.
Warren Cass, thank you.
Thank you very much. Sir?